Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift into the quiet backrooms of New York, where deals are sealed with nods instead of handshakes, and power moves silently behind closed doors. This is the world of John Gambino, a man who didn't chase attention, but commanded influence through discretion, patience, and carefully built alliances. Respect wasn't demanded in his world. It was understood, earned through loyalty and long memory. Most people couldn't survive a life like this, not because of open violence, but because it required living in a constant state of watchfulness, where every word carried weight and every favor came with a price. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city noise fade, and settle in as we ease into the quiet, calculating story of John Gambino. The first thing people noticed about John Gambino wasn't the size of his laugh or the flash of a suit. It was the way he listened. He had an ear that seemed to weigh sounds for truth, conversations that skimmed the surface, brimming with bravado and hurry, slid off him like rain off a roof. He let words settle into their meanings and watched how people rearranged themselves around those meanings. From that stillness, he learned how to move without being seen for the moving he did. He grew up in a neighborhood where everything had two faces, one for the daylight and one for the night. The daylight face traded in ordinary things, bread, small tools, shipments of goods that arrived and left on schedule. The night face carried other currencies, less visible but no less consequential. John came to understand that both faces were important because both kept the neighborhood alive. You could romanticize one and demonize the other, but that rarely helped anyone who had to buy bread in the morning. He learned early to judge actions by their consequences, not their appearances, and to prefer utility over glory. As a boy, he learned movement, how things moved, how people moved, how information moved. Movement is its own grammar, he would later think. The way a shipment is packaged tells you what a person values. The route someone takes reveals the routes he avoids. He watched delivery men and truckers more closely than any classroom lesson. He learned which markets closed on what days, which corners tolerated a late night, and how a small delay, repeated often, compounded into a problem nobody could solve in a single morning. There was a slow, careful curiosity in him. It wasn't showy. It didn't arrive with fanfare. It settled into habit. He made a point of knowing the names behind storefronts, the preferences of the clerks, who ran credit and why, who could be trusted in minor trouble and who could not. People entrusted him with small things, a message, a favor, the safe, keeping of a note. He treated these tiny trusts as serious things because in practice they were serious. The small things are where reputations are earned. John's patience was not the romantic kind that waits grandly for destiny. It was practical patience, the sort that organizes, that calibrates, that waits not because of virtue but because impatience cost lives and livelihoods. He saw how quickly a temper's flare could shatter months of careful arranging. He learned to set the temperature of a room rather than puncture it with fury. If someone needed to be persuaded, he persuaded quietly. If they needed to be stood down, he stood them down quietly. Loudness accomplishes something, sometimes, but loudness also leaves a soundscape you have to live with afterward. He preferred to leave rooms without noise. There were talents he developed that felt almost like crafts. The craft of timing a conversation so the person you needed would say precisely what they felt. The craft of answering with a question that unrolled someone's worries into a manageable length. The craft of making someone feel like a choice was theirs even when it had been carefully arranged. He prided himself on the small art of making space for others to be honorable, that, he thought, earned more durable loyalty than any speech or spectacle. As he grew into adulthood, John moved into work that required logistics, discretion, and an unflappable temperament. He prospered in an environment that valued steadiness. He wasn't showy, he was reliable. Men who claimed the spotlight made URLs and headlines. Men who arranged the quiet logistics made mornings possible. He preferred the mornings. Their regularity suited his temperament. There was dignity in the regular opening of doors, in deliveries fulfilled, in the certainty that someone would have what they needed by 9 a.m. Over time, he learned the geography of influence. It was less about titles and more about networks of dependence. Who got supplies? From whom, which stores relied on a single supplier, which neighborhoods had no spare credit to weather a delayed shipment. He became useful to others because he could see these dependencies and because he took care of them without making a drama of it. People who needed reliability remembered his name. They recommended him to friends. That kind of reputation grows slowly, but it is hard to displace. John believed in infrastructure, not the poetic kind, bridges and monuments, but the human infrastructure. Managers who kept promises, clerks who counted correctly, drivers who learned streets by habit, and the unglamorous paperwork that made a claim enforceable. The architecture of ordinary life, he thought, deserved as much attention as architecture that gets written about. If you could ensure the steady pulse of ordinary commerce, you had real power. The power to let people plan, to let children go to school and parents to buy food. That steadiness is a form of kindness, and for him it became a moral priority. The older he grew, the more he saw that discretion and discretion's companion, secrecy, were tools, not identities. You can be discreet and cruel, secretive but destructive. He tried to be discreet in service of something stable, not in service of ego. He wanted projects to succeed, not to be named after himself. He spent time thinking how to make systems resilient, to plan for storms, to keep small emergency funds, to create backups for people who had no fallback. He pushed for procedures that allowed repair without shame. That was his version of foresight. Yet he also understood that influence must be renewed, cannot rest on nostalgia. Systems that do not adapt break. That is why he welcomed select innovations, not everything new but those that fit human work. He tolerated technology when its purpose was to augment judgment and refused it when it promised to replace judgment with brittle automation. The world grows, he knew. The task is to help it. Grow without tearing out the things that let people live. People sometimes misunderstood his thrift, his refusal to display. They would speak of him as secretive, aloof, enigmatic. He accepted those labels as the price of moving without distraction. There was a deeper calculus. If a man dies because a rumor ran faster than sense, the rumor will survive longer than the man. He preferred being remembered by the mornings that opened, not by the stories written at noon. There were friendships of a certain kind, friendships built on mutual usefulness and a level of honesty that does not require performance. He had men who would answer his call at odd hours and women who managed ledgers with the kind of care that turned numbers into lives. He held those friendships in a practical reverence. They were the scaffolding of his life. He knew too how delicate such trust is. One careless lie, one puffed-up claim, can fracture it. So he watched his words and respected others. When moments of decision arrived, and they always do, John preferred process over impulse. He convened people, he listened to their practical constraints, and he chose options that left the community intact even if they reduced short-term gain. In his view, you can always grow a fortune. It is harder to rebuild trust. This discipline made him a man people turned to when things were uncertain. He had the rare quality of appearing calm even when the currents tugged hard. There were inevitably tensions. New generations grew hungry for bigger results faster. The world's tempo quickened and young men, full of promise and impatience, proposed bold rearrangements. Consolidations that promised efficiency, scale that promised wealth. These ideas had merit. Efficiency is not inherently evil, but the question he asked them, the question that often quieted a room, was practical. Who would be worst hit if we moved this way, and how would we make them whole? He asked that not to block progress, but to make it survivable. He liked small experiments. Pilot them, he would say. See how they behave in storms, in holidays, in normal, tedious Wednesdays. If a pilot breaks in predictable ways, you learn how to fix the design before you break a neighborhood. That pragmatic humility, treat the future like a prototype rather than a finished monument, became a guiding principle in his dealings. He wanted the city to be a place where innovation could happen without causing massacres of livelihoods. John was not blind to his era's moral complexity. He saw how lines blurred and how necessities hardened into moral compromises. Real life is often messy. Favors are traded, corners are cut, Promises are bent when someone has a mortgage due. He learned not to romanticize or to moralize that complexity, but to manage it. When a choice had to be made between harm and greater harm, he aimed to choose the path that preserved the most dignity. That, more than his desire for profit or power, defined his decisions. There were nights in which he would walk the old streets and let the city speak to him, not with the clang of news but with small sounds. A refrigerator humming, a neighbor's feet on the stair, the distant chime of a tram. He liked to imagine the life of a city as a machine of many small human adjustments, each one tending to someone's need. His work, he believed, was to keep those adjustments possible. John had a private habit that felt almost like a talisman. He kept a ledger not of finances but of favors he owed and favors he had received. The ledger was modest, written in a small notebook he carried. It had names, dates, and short notes, helped with license, paid in full, lent truck for day, repaid in labor. He treated this moral bookkeeping as seriously as any contract. It humbled him and reminded him that every advantage rests on interpersonal debts that require repayment. The ledger made him accountable, kept him honest. Even as his influence grew, he remained attentive to details that others dismissed. He could tell when a supplier's handwriting changed on invoices and when a delivery route slowed, not because of traffic but because the driver had become discouraged. These small attentions were not surveillance. They were care. They let him step in before a problem became a series of tragedies. He took the work seriously because he had seen the alternatives, the ways lives unspooled when logistics failed. And yet, for all his quiet competence, John was human. He loved small domestic comforts. A well-made sandwich, a book read slowly in the quiet after dinner, the warmth of a window on a cold morning. He held a private affection for small rituals. A steady cup of coffee at the same table, a call to a sister on birthdays, things that anchored him against the drifting social weather. These rituals reminded him that power is not an end. It is a means to living a life where people can plan. This first part of John's story closes on a modest note. The man who listens more than he speaks, who values continuity over spectacle, who measures success in mornings rather than headlines. He is surrounded by change, and that change will test his patience, his ingenuity, and his sense of what matters. He is not a hero in the cinematic sense. He is a craftsman of steadiness. What happens when the world demands speed and the people around him start to taste the rush of rapid progress? That is the question waiting in the next chapter, quietly, like a railway switch set to be thrown. For now, the city sleeps with its small lights on, and John Gambino stands ready, not for drama, but for the slow work of keeping mornings possible. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that John knew well, the kind that pretends nothing is changing while everything is quietly rearranging itself underneath. He moved through his days with the same careful pace, but he listened more closely now. Not because danger announced itself, but because subtlety often arrived before consequence. When people begin to repeat themselves, when proposals circle back with slightly altered language, when urgency starts wearing the clothes of reason, that's when attention matters most. John spent more time walking than sitting. He believed walking loosened the truth. People spoke differently when their bodies were in motion, when they weren't framed by desks or sharpened by agendas. On these walks, he learned which ideas had roots and which were floating, which ambitions were backed by patience and which by impatience alone. He asked questions that sounded innocent. How would this work on a rainy Tuesday? Who handles it when the phone doesn't get answered? What happens if the usual guy is sick? And he watched how people responded. Good plans welcomed those questions. Fragile ones flinched. He noticed a generational shift not in age, but in temperament. Some of the newer voices spoke in accelerations. They wanted scale first and repair later. They trusted models more than memory, projections more than patterns. John didn't dismiss them. He had learned long ago that arrogance grows when it feels ignored. Instead, he asked them to sit with him over coffee, to talk through their ideas without slides or audiences. In those quieter settings, some softened, others doubled down. Both reactions told him what he needed to know. His own reputation complicated things. Because he was known for discretion, people assumed he would quietly approve or quietly block. He had to resist both expectations. Approval without conditions would betray the lives tethered to the systems he helped maintain. Blocking outright would push ambition underground, where it grew sharper and more dangerous. So he chose a third path: conditional engagement, pilot programs, small tests, limited exposure. If something worked in miniature, it could be trusted in scale. If it failed small, it taught lessons cheaply. There were afternoons when he reviewed ledgers that told stories no one else read. A sudden dip in overtime here, a spike in returns there, each number a shadow cast by a human decision. He learned to read those shadows the way others read headlines. When a clerk cut hours to meet a target, families felt it weeks later. When a driver rushed a route, repairs came due quietly but inevitably. John annotated margins with questions and followed them to their sources, not to punish, but to correct. Correction preserved more than punishment ever could. At home, life remained deliberately modest. He and his partner shared meals that required little preparation but invited conversation. They spoke about the city the way gardeners speak about soil, what was growing too fast, what needed thinning, what had to be protected through the cold. She knew when not to ask questions, and he knew when to answer anyway. Their relationship thrived on that balance. It was a private training ground for the same restraint he practiced in public. He also made time for people who were never in meetings: drivers, stockroom workers, small shop owners. He asked them what they were noticing, not in surveys or formal sessions, but in the spaces where truth surfaced naturally. A driver mentioned a new construction zone that slowed deliveries every Thursday. A shop owner mentioned a supplier who had begun cutting corners. These were not complaints, they were data points. John filed them away and adjusted plans before those small frictions became real problems. One evening, a younger associate came to him frustrated. "It feels like we're always slowing down," the man said, "like we're afraid to move." John didn't correct him immediately. He let the frustration breathe. Then he said, "Speed is useful when you know where you're going. Slowing down is useful when you're not sure. Most people don't know the difference." The man frowned, thinking. That pause mattered. John wasn't trying to win an argument. He was trying to teach a habit of mind. As pressure built elsewhere, investors asking questions, planners sharpening proposals, John kept returning to the same principle: resilience before expansion. He drafted contingency frameworks that others found tedious: backup routes, emergency funds, cross-training plans. He insisted that if something couldn't survive a bad month, it didn't deserve a good year. This philosophy made him unpopular in rooms where optimism was currency. But it also made him indispensable when optimism ran out. There were moments of doubt. He wasn't immune to them. Late at night, he wondered whether his caution would eventually be overtaken by momentum he could no longer guide, whether the systems he protected would evolve past him. But doubt, to John, was not paralysis. It was a signal to prepare others. He began quietly transferring knowledge, introducing people who should know each other, documenting processes that had lived only in his head, encouraging younger voices to ask better questions instead of louder ones. He understood something that few admitted aloud: continuity doesn't happen by accident. It's built, defended, and handed off. If he wanted the values he cared about to survive, he couldn't be their sole guardian. He had to make them ordinary, teachable, repeatable. So he leaned into that work, less visible, more foundational. He corrected language in proposals to include responsibility clauses. He asked for metrics that measured harm avoided, not just profit gained. He praised restraint when it prevented a problem, even if no one else noticed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the culture shifted. Not enough to make headlines, enough to matter. By the end of that season, John sensed the ground firming under his feet. Not because the future was certain, but because the system had learned how to absorb uncertainty without panic. The ambitions were still there. The speed still tempted. But now there were brakes, buffers, and people who knew how to use them. He walked home one night under streetlights that flickered like tired stars and felt something close to quiet satisfaction. Not triumph, not relief, just the sense that For now, the machinery of ordinary life was still turning without grinding anyone down. The harder tests hadn't arrived yet. He knew that. They never announced themselves early. But he also knew this. When they did arrive, they would find a system that had been prepared not for perfection, but for survival. The weeks folded into one another like careful pages turned, and the small tests John had insisted on finally began to show their worth. Pilots that once looked like theory now exposed patterns. Which routes buckled under rain, which suppliers shrank margins until quality collapsed, which drivers preferred the security of a steady run to the siren call of a bigger, riskier job. The data pleased the men who loved numbers and reassured the ones who loved people. It made the arguments more concrete and harder to dismiss. Yet facts alone rarely settle disputes. People do not change because a spreadsheet proves them wrong. They change when the cost of being wrong becomes too obvious to justify. John understood this. He spent far more time translating data into human terms than he did producing the data itself. He'd sit down with someone and show them, in plain language and small arithmetic, how one decision created a month of hardship for a family, how a delayed payroll rippled into a school absence, a late notice, an uneasy landlord. He didn't appeal to pity. He appealed to consequence, to the arithmetic of survival. Men who once mouthed expansion learned to feel the cost in practical terms, and that made some of them slow down. Not all of them. A subset, greedy, impatient, or simply convinced by theory, kept pushing. They would not accept pilots as definitive. They argued for rollout and scale because scale is where profit multiplies and portfolios look tidy. Those men began to show a different temperament. They were polite in meetings and restless in corridors, moving like the current under a frozen surface. John watched them the way a gardener watches a vine that might choke a sapling. He could not pretend not to see what their impatience might do if left unchecked. One afternoon, a larger actor entered the picture, an investment firm with money and patience for scaling. They spoke the language of markets and timelines and used terms like efficiency gains and synergies, as if those words could conjure human resilience. They brought promises: capital for modernization, contracts with big clients, a brand that would seal deals. For some leaders, the firm's offer was the future presented as inevitable. For others, it was a hazard masked in polite PowerPoint. John met the firm's representatives in a glassed conference room with the river drifting beyond the windows. They were smooth, articulate, and used phrases that sounded like wind. They asked about growth, about timelines, about what it would take to make profits appear faster. John asked different questions. He asked how the firm measured failure, whether their model accounted for weather, for holidays, for cultural festivals when transport patterns changed, for the mental fatigue of drivers who logged extra hours to make up algorithmic shortfalls. The representatives answered in contracts and assurances. Contracts can be clever things. They can hide in legalese the reality of what happens when forecasts miss. After the meeting, he walked back through the neighborhood, past the bakery that had once given him a loaf in thanks. He watched the kids dart between legs and thought of scale not as a number but as a pressure that bends lives. He believed, truly believed, that money could be useful if harnessed to durability rather than haste. So he accepted meeting the investors again, but not to be placated. He laid down conditions: oversight, measurable protections, an independent audit with teeth, a pilot phase that could be terminated, without penalty if harm exceeded agreed thresholds. He insisted that capital come with guardrails. To some, he sounded old-fashioned, to others, sensible. In private, he sensed impatience bristle at the edges. The firm's people could not promise everything. Contracts are taut strings that resist being stretched in multiple directions at once. They wanted returns. He wanted survivability. They shuffled terms and smiled politely. Negotiations like that rarely become headlines. They become amendments and clauses, the slow stitching of law to practice. Meanwhile, the human work continued. The apprentices he trusted were learning to be both careful and decisive. One of them, Rosa, had a knack for seeing the small fractals of consequence that adults often missed. The way a route tweak might make a mother accept a third shift, or the way a pay schedule change could force a student to drop a class. John began to let her lead small negotiations on her own. She was tenacious without being loud, and she asked the sort of questions that forced clarity. Watching her in action felt like watching one of his own practices take root in someone else. He took a quiet pride in that, the kind that does not require a witness. But not every test ended in the small repairs he loved. An incident happened, tame by dramatic standards yet telling in what it revealed. A courier working for a small subcontractor was late delivering an important batch to a partner shop. The shop missed its rush, lost income, and the owner's temper flared in a way that turned private worry into a public complaint. Word reached an influential client who, worried about predictability, threatened to move business. It was a modest episode until it collided with the rumor mill. Someone started whispering that the whole operation couldn't be relied on, that consolidation might be the only sure way forward. Rumors are small fires. They spread by breath and often in spaces where facts are scarce. John moved quickly and, quietly, he arranged for an interim delivery from a cooperative of small owners, covered the temporary deficit personally through an advance, and opened a line of communication with the worried client. He did not seek credit. He wanted the client to return with confidence and for the rumor to die where it had begun. In the end, the client stayed and the shop owner's temper cooled. Small repairs had worked again, but the episode exposed a vulnerability. Perception can topple stability as easily as a broken axle. That episode hardened some opinions. Men with influence used it as an example of fragility. Investors saw it as a risk. The ambitious argued for a faster fix that amounted to consolidation. John used it differently. He documented the incident, then used it in a meeting to argue for a robust response. Better subcontractor vetting, a shared contingency fund, and a rapid response team with authority to deploy drivers or funds immediately when a delivery failed. He framed it not as a case for surrendering to scale, but as a reason to institutionalize repair. Institutionalization, he believed, made such incidents less damaging. Meanwhile, not everyone in his orbit shared his ethics about discretion. One of the younger men, eager and bold, misread an informal favor and used it as leverage in a negotiation that should have been handled with care. The move was clumsy and produced friction. John intervened, not with a rebuke shouted across the table, but with a short, firm set of corrections and a private conversation about dignity and consequence. The man, abashed, adjusted course. John's method was not about humiliation. It was about instruction. He preferred correction that preserved the actor's ability to reintegrate rather than exile them for a public lesson. Above all, the broader landscape kept shifting. New competitors from abroad whispered of faster systems tailored to scale. City regulations nudged at delivery windows and loading rules in ways that could help or hurt various players. The pilots chugged along, and data accumulated like rings in a tree. John watched those rings and marked seasons, winter stress, holiday surges, a festival that rerouted traffic one autumn and taught him a valuable lesson about redundancy. He also felt the political winds change. A new council member, young and brusque, announced an initiative aimed at urban efficiency that included incentives for consolidation. The rhetoric was glossy. Fewer trucks, cleaner streets, smarter cities. The incentives were real, but so were the potential costs. John kept his distance from political posturing. Instead, he engaged with city staff, asking them to model outcomes not only for totals saved but for human displacement. He proposed amendments that would include a phased approach and explicit support for retraining. The staff listened. The council member, hungry for a tidy win, balked at extra constraints. Lobbying in bureaucratic corridors is less glamorous than headlines but often more consequential. John scheduled meetings, wrote memos, and invited partners to testify. All this attentive work brought its own strain. He slept badly on some nights, the kind of wakeful thinking that runs scenarios in the dark. Not fear. He was not a fearful man, but a meticulous unfolding of possibilities. He'd wake at 2, jot notes, and then return to a restless doze. The apprentices noticed his weariness and offered to take more burden. He declined some offers and accepted others, all the while moving his practice from doing everything himself to enabling a system that could handle shocks without him. The story of this phase closed on a small victory that felt like the right kind. The firm's pilot completed its first season with results that were mixed but promising. The investors agreed to table a large-scale rollout until key protections were strengthened. The council members' incentives went forward, but with clauses that required verified safeguards for small operators, a win for the cautious coalition. The newsroom did not write a banner headline. Instead, a local paper ran a modest piece about innovation with safeguards, and a baker in a neighborhood John frequented waved at him from across an alley, bread in hand. John accepted the smallness of such victories. They were what they were, quiet, durable. He had learned by then that a life measured in grand battles often left people broken in its wake. He wanted neither battles nor the brittle victories they produced. He wanted mornings. He wanted the small guarantees that make ordinary life possible. And so he continued, walking, asking questions, welding buffers into policy, aware that the larger tests were still unfolding, but reassured that, for now, the system could absorb more stress than it could a year before. As spring melted into a brighter pace, he allowed himself a small optimism. Not because the future was certain, but because for the first time more people in the room were asking the right follow-up questions. Who pays, who trains, who replaces, and how do we measure if people are genuinely better off? That cultural shift mattered far more than any single contract. It was, perhaps, the most important kind of scaling, a scale of attention rather than only of profit. He did not, however, mistake the present calm for permanent safety. The next wave, larger deals, more capital, greater incentives, was coming. He felt its approach like the change in air before a storm. His work, already complex, would soon require different kinds of courage. The courage to insist on protections even when pressure to drop them mounted, and the courage to let go when others proved steadier in the art of repair. For now, though, John Gambino walked the neighborhood, listened to the smaller noises, and kept a ledger in his pocket of favors repaid and debts owed. He taught apprentices to ask the questions that mattered and to measure success not in glossy charts but in the count of mornings that opened on time. The road ahead promised both peril and possibility. He would keep doing what he could to tilt that balance toward repair. The city was full of small, human futures. He intended to keep as many of them alive as possible. The spring thaw brought more than puddles and earlier sun. It brought a new tempo to meetings and a sharper edge to emails. The investors wanted timelines. The city wanted results. The pilots wanted to graduate into the world. And some folks in the room who loved tidy outcomes wanted the guardrails loosened so the numbers looked cleaner. John understood both pressures. He also understood that tidy numbers could be cruel to people who did not show up in the spreadsheet. One morning he arrived at a meeting to find the air inside taut, like a drumhead. The lead representative for the investment firm had a new proposal sense made into a single slide. Accelerate rollout if the oversight committee agreed to a temporary easing of one clause that required a minimum level of local hiring. The firm insisted this would attract clients and make the math sing. A senior council staffer, eager for headlines about efficiency, hinted that if the city wanted to be seen as modern, it might consider flexibility. Even some younger men who had once listened to John's long view now looked at him with an impatience that felt like a test. John did not begin with a speech. He began with a question he had asked before in quieter rooms. Show me the failure case. It was a simple way to make people stop speaking in future tense optimism and begin to contend with the messy present. The room shuffled through models, lawyers produced clauses, consultants offered mitigations. The investors proposed insurance-like ladders, triggers that would force them to buy back shares if outcomes worsened. The offer was neat until someone asked a practical follow-up. Who pays the workers who are displaced during the gap between a failed rollout and the buyback? The investors' math did not include the hesitancy of rents and the reality of payroll cycles. The difference between elegant finance and lived months can be a gulf that swallows ordinary people. John asked for a pause and walked outside. The sunlight felt too bright for such a small moral measurement. He thought of the courier who had been late months before, of the baker who had taken a day's loss because a block of product hadn't arrived on time, and of Rosa, the apprentice who had come into her own asking the small, courageous questions. If they loosened protections now and something went wrong, the damage would not be abstract. It would be in the hesitant voice of a single parent, the unpaid tuition of a student, the quiet eviction notice slid under a door. He returned inside and proposed a different path. Allow the investors the accelerated window, but only if an escrow fund large enough to cover 3 months of payroll for affected small operators was created first and fully funded before any clause was relaxed. Make the fund independent and transparent. Make it accessible within 48 hours of verified displacement. Finally, require that a portion of the initial returns be set aside to seed community retraining programs. The counterproposal did not please the investors because it asked them to put real capital into social durability rather than merely promising guardrails in legalese. It pleased some of the council staff because their job is, in part, to keep politicians from regretting voter anger later. The room hummed with negotiation, the kind that repairs and the kind that threatens to rend sat in uneasy adjacency. John felt exhausted afterward, but not defeated. His role, at times like this, was less to win than to make sure the world did not tilt on the basis of convenience. Concessions, when demanded, should cost someone's balance sheet rather than someone's kitchen table. Outside the office, the neighborhood had its own quieter tensions. A rival network, newer and unencumbered by the cultures of repair that John had worked to instill, began offering higher pay to drivers with the soft promise that the new model would do away with obstacles. Drivers had families and bills. Higher pay looms like a bright lantern to anyone who has struggled. It's natural to step toward it. John knew this reality intimately. He also knew that loyalty is not bought only with cash. It is bought with a combination of dignity, steady schedules, and the sense that one's work matters because someone is watching out for the small harms. He asked Rosa to lead a quiet conversation with drivers over coffee. She went without his lecturing, without the weight of authority that might make men close rather than speak. She was practical, gentle, and precise. She listened to the drivers' grievances, which were, in truth, pragmatic. Late routes that sliced sleep, sudden reroutes, occasional unreimbursed tolls. Then she proposed small, immediate fixes, adjusting schedules to preserve sleep windows, clarifying reimbursement practices, and creating a modest night differential fund that would top up pay when someone made an extra-mile run during a festival. Those were not grand changes, but they were real. The drivers came away less tempted by the bright promises from the competitor. Not because John had lectures waiting for them, but because someone had taken their hours, their rest, and their dignity seriously. This was the art John had taught. Don't merely counter a promise with more work. Respond with protection. People can be seduced by higher pay when their needs are pressing. You lessen the seduction by making immediate alleviation available and by embedding them into a system that treats their time like a human right, not an optimization problem. Weeks of such attention created slow wins. The escrow negotiations moved forward. A small but real fund was created that required the investor to lock coins into accounts accessible under defined circumstances. Rosa's driver fixes became a modest handbook for scheduling, later distributed in a binder at the dispatch hub. The oversight committee found its rhythm and grew more competent. Audits felt less like traps and more like useful checks. Yet every positive step also sharpened opposition. Men who had expected speed and clean returns grew tired of paperwork. They whispered about bureaucracy's ability to strangle advantage, not recognizing that advantage without repair is often short-lived. Then, in the middle of this fragile truce, an unexpected legal inquiry arrived from a federal office. The letter was procedural, the sort that asks for documents and timelines. No one in the neighborhood panicked. These things happen. Yet the timing was awkward. It landed just as the investor negotiations approached a critical junction, and rumors spun faster than facts. A handful of anxious partners, worried by the prospect of scrutiny, started to speak in swift, fearful tones about cutting ties or moving assets. The rumor about legal inspection mutated into whispers about instability and, in some corners, into old-fashioned fear that everything might be seized or that operations might be disrupted. John, never one to court drama or to sow panic, convened his inner circle and asked for a modest plan. Be transparent, provide requested documents promptly, and prepare a public statement that explained the inquiry as routine and procedural. He also dispatched Rosa to ensure that communications to the workforce were clear. Keep calm. We are cooperating. Your pay will be covered if anything delays. The strategy was not to deny risk, but to reduce the social contagion of that risk. Panic grows when people imagine their worst without being offered a clear, small alternative. The federal matter wound slowly through desks and signatures. Documents were produced. Timelines explained. The investors watched closely. Some considered pausing. Others used the delay as leverage to ask for quicker terms. Meanwhile, the Oversight Committee formally authorized an emergency protocol. In the event of systemic legal interruption, a temporary independent manager would be appointed to maintain payroll and services until things cleared. That protocol felt bureaucratic and cold on a paper, but in practice it was a quiet magnet for calm. It told drivers and shopkeepers that there was a plan that prioritized their mornings, even if the grown-up conversations took place in offices that smelled of legal paper and municipal coffee. In the midst of the legal slow burn, John found himself assessing more personal math. Longevity in this kind of work is not merely about tactics. It's about the willingness to keep engaging day after day. He thought about apprentices like Rosa, who had a life unfolding beyond the office, and about the drivers whose children would not wait while capital worked its way through paperwork. He started to speak more openly about succession, not in terms of titles, but in terms of shared responsibility. Who would write the manuals, who would lead the oversight, who would be able to take emergency calls at 2 in the morning and act with judgment. He began to push responsibility outward not only because of fatigue, but because real resilience requires multiple minds in the arena. When, at last, the federal inquiry concluded largely without incident, an exchange of clarifying documents, a few routine requests, the neighborhood side, the investors, watching both the documents and the human choreography, agreed to maintain their schedule but accepted the escrow terms in full. The council publicly commended the oversight arrangements and the pilot's cautious expansion, which made for quiet press. The headlines were small. The local paper ran a modest note about measured growth. That kind of modesty pleased John more than the more sensational coverage he had long avoided. The season settled into an uneasy stability. The hubs expanded under conditions that kept some small operators whole. Some displaced people found retraining and modest employment. Others opened new shop niches they hadn't imagined before. It was not a clean victory. It never would be. People lost things along the road. Some families required months of assistance. John made sure they had it. He watched, at night, the apprentices lead meetings, the drivers steward new schedules, and the oversight committee enforce agreements with a pragmatism he had hoped to seed. What the months taught him most clearly was that progress and harm often arrive linked. The work is to sever the linkage before it does too much damage. That requires attention, money set aside for repair, authority to act fast, and a culture that values the question, who pays? As much as it values the question, how soon? John had spent a lifetime learning to ask those questions. Now he had taught others enough that the habit felt like a weather pattern rather than an instruction. On a quiet late afternoon, as the light softened and the neighborhood took on the warm glaze of evening, John walked with Rosa and 2 other apprentices along a side street. They talked about small things, the baker's new recipe, a mechanic's penchant for odd jokes, then about the oversight report that was due next week. Rosa spoke up, not to seek approval, but to report a minor logistic improvement she had implemented. Her voice sounded steadier than it had months earlier. She had learned in the field what his questions meant. John listened, then smiled in that private way he reserved for small, satisfying proofs. The culture was beginning to hold even when he was not in the room. The work ahead was still formidable. The investors would press, competitors would tempt, politicians would tweet. But the neighborhood had more tools now than it had before. They had binders, funds, protocols, and people who knew how to fix small fires. He did not imagine the world would now be safe indefinitely. He had learned the humility of one who sees the horizon change daily. Still, he allowed himself a small measure of contentment as the sun slid down behind the old brick facades. The city would wake in the morning, the baker would open, the drivers would begin their rounds, and somewhere along the way a child would get to school on time because an adult had done an unremarked but necessary thing yesterday. That quiet thought felt like enough for then. John Gambino had not solved the future. He had merely bought it some room to be more humane. He would continue to ask the persistent questions and to insist that the costs of change be paid not by those who could not afford them. For now, that work continued in the small hours, in binders and coffee shops, in the careful allocation of funds and attention, and in the steady, unshowy pleasure of mornings that arrived without fear. The late summer felt like a mood rather than a season. Hot days that creaked into humid nights, and a city that never quite breathed freely. The pilots were running full. The hubs had scaled enough that efficiencies showed up in reports, and people in tidy suits liked the sound of those numbers. But numbers, John knew, were often a telescope view of many small lives. The real test of any system is how it behaves on the worst days disguised as ordinary ones. The festival weekends, the rainstorms, the sudden traffic detours that turn a route into a maze. He had spent his life preparing for those subtle shocks precisely because they exposed the gaps spreadsheets smooth over. The festival arrived mid-August, a cheerful contradiction of noise and ritual that brought holiday shoppers to the neighborhood and filled the quarter with scent and song. The increased demand was an opportunity, the sort of day that could make the proponents of consolidation say, "See, scale works," and that could make investors pat themselves on the back over coffee. For a while, the pilot's optimizations handled volume. Then, the unexpected happened. A sinkhole on a side street chewed up 2 lanes of traffic and rerouted dozens of trucks through a narrow pair of avenues. What would normally be a minor delay morphed into a backlog that lengthened with the day, and the algorithm that promised savings on average minutes began to misorder priorities. The first sign was a frantic call from a florist. Roses wilted. A wedding at 3 missed a slot. The kind of personal disaster that makes reputations fray. Then a bakery called about frozen dough that needed immediate attention. Drivers at the hub texted about being held for hours while their hours counted down, and the app insisted on routes that routed them in circles. Panic whispered in corners. Rumors that consolidation had not yet built resilience spread fast. The thin veneer of calm threatened to crack. John felt that old particular pressure settle into his chest, the one that made sleep light and coffee necessary. He did not believe in theatrics, but neither did he believe in paralysis. He had built contingency plans for just such moments, and the time had come to test them for real. He called a meeting short, direct, without slides, and asked for a clear list. Who was down, where, and what resource could fix each problem within an hour. He empowered the oversight team to use the escrow funds immediately for frontline relief and authorized Rosa and 2 apprentices to coordinate drivers and temporary swaps. Rosa moved like water through a pile of stones. She had learned from months of quiet corrections that people respond to clarity and speed. She organized relay drivers, negotiated short-term swaps with small independent operators unaffiliated with the pilot, and arranged for a mechanic with a truck to carry chilled goods across a safer path. An apprentice negotiated with a wedding planner directly, arranging an emergency bouquet replacement from a neighboring supplier and a carrier willing to make the run. These were not grand gestures. They were the precisely timed small acts that prevent panic from becoming collapse. Within hours, the worst of the backlog eased. Drivers who had been on the verge of leaving for greener pastures felt the difference between being scolded with an app and being supported by a human who could call the manager and say, "Take the extra half hour. I'll cover this." A baker who had feared a ruined weekend instead received an emergency delivery and a short-term credit to cover lost sales until the next payroll. The florist, though shaken, recovered enough to get the wedding flowers to the church. Late, but present. The headlines did not write themselves. Instead, gratitude made small rounds. A note, a loaf, an offer of help the next time a truck needed repair. The system had, in those crucial hours, lived up to the scaffolding John had insisted on. It proved that the escrow and the emergency protocols were not mere paperwork but living instruments. He allowed himself a private, small satisfaction. Yet satisfaction in his line of work is a modest thing. It is not the end of a story but a marker that the stitching held. He also knew the lesson. Pilots that survive storms look promising. Pilots that survive many storms build legitimacy. But legitimacy invites new pressure. Investors, rightly pleased by the mitigation, now asked for accelerated timelines again, but with sharper teeth. They wanted earlier conversion into full-scale contracts, and they wanted guarantees that reductions in operating cost could be realized faster. They were not being malicious, they were being investors. Capital asks for returns. John understood that and remained unafraid of the practical virtue of investment. Still, the mood in the rooms where deals were shaped had changed. The business pitches grew more insistent, the lawyers adjusted clauses, and the council people who liked headlines saw political advantage in being pro-growth. He found himself walking the corridor between two kinds of danger: the ruin that comes from unchecked haste, and the quiet erosion that comes from letting momentum sweep away provisions in the interest of speed. At night, after the festival rush receded, John sat at his small kitchen table with the binders open before him. He had spent years teaching the apprentices to read the margins. What did a tiny line in a ledger imply about a household? Where did a policy note show the need for a human override? The apprentices were alive with energy now, and he wanted their voices to be the ones that carried forward. He had to choose how much of himself to keep at the center and how much to disperse. The festival had shown him his team could act, but it had also shown that the more competent the team appeared, the stronger the argument for bringing in capital to scale. Competence seduced investors. Seduction can unsettle balance. A new kind of temptation whispered at the edges of the neighborhood's meetings. The promise of a complete platform that would pair the hubs with a logistics marketplace, offering drivers and shops instant visibility and access. The platform sounded modern and useful. It promised to smooth the rough edges of matching supply with demand. It could, if implemented kindly, make life easier for many. But platforms also carry a logic of their own. They centralize data and dependence and, if not governed, can strip leverage from local people whose trade had been mediated through relationships and trust rather than an algorithm. John asked the obvious question: who controlled the platform, and what happened to human judgment in the presence of optimization? The platform's representatives arrived with demos and neat assurances. They talked about APIs and uptime percentages. John listened and asked about governance, data ownership, and recourse when the platform made a harmful decision. He asked who would represent the drivers and small operators in the platform's advisory board and whether the escrow or the oversight committee would have priority access to pause or override the platform's matching algorithm in emergencies. The team's eyes, while polite, slid impatiently. Platforms scale quickly when not slowed by the messy business of democratic safeguards. John's insistence on human primacy sounded quaint beside promises of efficiency gains. He did not oppose progress. He opposed the surrender of agency in the name of speed. So he proposed a controlled adoption. Pilot the platform's modules that offered transparent matching while requiring that any automatic route changes be subject to a human override within 15 minutes during trial. That driver-reported conditions be integrated into the algorithm's inputs immediately, and that data remain jointly owned by operators and the platform with clear rules about access. He also insisted that the escrow be used to guarantee pay for any driver whose hours were negatively impacted by algorithmic reassignments during the trial. These were protective measures, not obstacles. The platform representatives bristled at mandated escrow usage and human override clauses. They wanted frictionless adoption. But friction, John argued, is not necessarily bad. It is the material of caution. An algorithm that runs amok can displace lives as efficiently as it can create profit. He wanted to ensure that efficiency had margins large enough for compassion. The negotiation went on for weeks, and while the platform's slickness threatened to win in rooms where speed is worshipped, John worked to make the platform's legal and ethical scaffolding as robust as its code. Throughout this tense period, the apprentices grew visibly in confidence. Rosa, in particular, had become a fulcrum, someone who could speak to drivers one moment and present policy recommendations to a city staffer the next, all without changing her tone. She had a clarity that came from hours spent asking who pays and who recovers, and then walking the resulting plans out to their human endpoints. John watched her with the kind of pride that does not require applause. He knew that cultivating such people was the best way to scale values. If the culture could flow through more hands, there would be less chance that a single absence would collapse the careful networks they had built. The turning point that late summer produced was not a sudden event, but a layered pressure that split along lines of capital, technology, and community. When one of the investors proposed an aggressive conversion clause, accelerate or be penalized, John convened a meeting and asked that party, publicly and directly, to model a failure scenario in concrete numbers, not hypothetical language. He asked them to include the payroll implications for the 3 smallest operators and asked them to produce a remediation plan that included immediate payments within 24 hours, not promises contingent on litigation or delay. The investors produced spreadsheets and projected returns, but their remediation plan was thin. John's demand was not a veto but a moral litmus. If capital wished to move quicker, it must carry the tangible cost of failures with it. Under the weight of such insistence, one investor chose to walk away. The investor's exit, while not dramatic in itself, was a signal. Others stayed but agreed to firmer escrow requirements and clearer oversight power. The neighborhood breathed more easily in the immediate wake of that choice, but John felt the loss keenly. The capital that left would likely find another, less cautious place to invest. Gains, he realized, are competitive commodities. The moral cooling effect he sought would make the neighborhood less immediately attractive to some funds, but more just for the people who worked and slept in its blocks. That moral calculation, short-term attractiveness versus long-term survivability, was an old choice for John. He had always favored the latter, and he had never ceased to be aware that favoring it could cost opportunities. The trick was not to be indifferent to those costs, but to make their payment explicit to those who demanded growth. If someone wanted accelerated returns, someone had to be prepared to protect the people who might otherwise pay for it. That principle had become the spine of the neighborhood's acceptance criteria for partners. As autumn crept in, bringing cooler air and a certain clarity, John found a rhythm that felt sustainable for the moment. The platform pilots continued with the human override clauses. The escrow clauses remained in place, and the oversight committee enforced them with an increasing competence that made municipal staff nod with approval. The apprentices ran operations with growing autonomy. The drivers and small operators had more voice and slightly more security in their schedules. The investors who stayed had accepted a slower, steadier curve of returns, less shiny but more dependable. Yet John, who had learned to look a few moves ahead, knew the work did not end. The cultural shift mattered most. Not the contracts themselves, but the habit of asking what the downstream costs would be. If that questioning became part of the ordinary lexicon, then the protections would last beyond any single set of clauses. He kept working to make the habit contagious. He invited civic leaders to ride along on the night runs. He encouraged journalists to write not only about innovation's promise, but also about how ordinary lives are preserved. He taught apprentices to build checklists and to demand that every deal contain a plan for repair. One evening, as he walked home with Rosa at his side, she asked a question that startled him by its simplicity. "Do you ever regret making the escrow so hard to accept?" she asked. It was not a philosophical question. It was a practical one. If you make a system less attractive, do you lose good capital and with it potential opportunities? He considered the shapes of his life, the small acts and the preserved mornings, and answered with the kind of directness he preferred. "I regret only when I let short-term fear make the decisions. I don't regret protecting people. The cost of losing a neighborhood is rarely measured in spreadsheets, but it is always paid in ways that matter." She nodded, absorbing the line not as rhetoric but as guidance. He felt, for a moment, the neatness of passing on both practice and principle. The night closed like it always did. Lights dimming, storefronts locking, a car or two passing in the distance. John thought about the months to come, about winter storms and holiday runs and the perpetual tug between speed and repair. He thought about the apprentices, the drivers, the investors who stayed and those who left, and about the platform that could be a force for good if its guardians did not let it run faster than their capacity to protect. The story did not end with a tidy resolution. It continued, as these arrangements always must, into the slow work of governance. For John, that was fine. He had never wanted a story that ended in applause. He wanted a life that endured. He wanted mornings to keep coming, and if that required patience, negotiation, the occasional refusal to accept speed without cushion, then so be it. The neighborhood would not win every argument. It would, however, keep enough people fed and working that the next crisis might be met with a system that remembered what mattered. As they walked, Rosa spoke of a small improvement she believed could reduce route friction next month. The apprentices debated whether the oversight committee should hire an independent auditor with roots in labor organizing. John listened and offered notes. The work folded into itself like careful stitching. Problem, small solution, handoff, test, and repair. It was quiet work. It was, he thought, the sort of work that outlived headlines. There would be more pressure soon, new capital, new platforms, new policies, and John expected to spend many mornings and nights negotiating their terms. He had no illusions about the difficulty, but he had learned, through many small tests and repairs, that a community that learned the habit of repair was harder to dislodge and easier to defend. That thought kept him moving, step by step, toward the next conversation, the next negotiation, the next small action that would let a baker sleep through another night knowing their payroll would come. The air after that autumn felt different, less raw with argument and more threaded with tentative agreements. The Oversight Committee had settled into a rhythm of small, exacting checks. People who once saw audits as inconveniences now learned they could be tools. A way to prove credibility to cautious investors, a way to document progress for the city, and a way to make sure the people whose mornings depended on the system were not forgotten when contracts were signed. John liked that kind of slow accretion. It suited him. It was the work of building habit where once there had only been preference. Winter was approaching, and with it the obvious tests. Shortened daylight, salt on the roads, trucks that started slower and routes that required more cushion. If pilots had taught them anything, it was that stress multiplies when the environment grows harder. So John spent October preparing, not in speeches but in mechanics. He met with the dispatchers to review emergency reroutes. He had Rosa run a dry exercise where drivers practiced a snow reroute that bypassed steep hills and narrow turns. He arranged for an emergency pool of extra fuel cards and organized agreements with local mechanics for priority repair. These were small acts, but, in his experience, they carried the same moral weight as an oath. They guaranteed someone could get to work even when the city conspired against schedules. The platform's deployment continued in a measured way. Its dashboard glittered with promise, real-time matches, improved fill rates, analytics. That made spreadsheets sing. Yet behind the clean interface were human stories. A driver in Queens who preferred his particular morning loop because it let him take his daughter to school. A small grocer whose afternoon deliveries coordinated with an elderly customer who relied on that particular timing. John insisted the platform honor these human constraints. He argued that any automated match must consult a human-set constraint list before imposing a change. Rosa wrote the constraint templates and trained the operators to use them. It was the kind of small governance that, when designed well, lets technology breathe while people live. He also began to think more explicitly about narrative. People respond to story. If you frame change as a clean victory, technology cleans everything up, then the people displaced feel like collateral in someone else's plot. If you frame change as a careful process with built-in protections, then people begin to see themselves as part of a negotiated future rather than casualties of progress. John convened a short series of community listening sessions, not the performative kind with microphones and PR, but tables where drivers, small owners, city staff, and platform engineers could speak plainly. He asked questions that cut through rhetoric. When did you feel most exposed? And what single fix would ease that feeling? The answers were simple and practical and required little heroics. Clearer routes, more transparent pay notices, faster access to emergency funds. He put those answers in a binder and circulated them. It was not glamorous, but it mattered. When engineers suggested system changes, the binder was the first stop. When lawyers proposed contract language, the binder was the translation. How would this read to a driver who had to choose between a run and a family obligation? If the wording didn't pass that test, it needed to be rethought. Over time, John noticed that the binder functioned as a moral compass that didn't preach. It reminded everyone, gently but insistently, that human dignity could be coded into the system if people insisted on it. There were quieter hazards as well. As the network stabilized, other neighborhoods noticed. Offers came from municipal partners and civic groups who wanted to replicate the model. Replication is flattering and dangerous in equal measure. What worked in one place sometimes failed in another because the human seams, existing relationships, informal credit lines, local habits differed. John agreed to advise but insisted that any replication begin with listening. He would not export a set of hard rules and expect them to function when dropped into a different social fabric. He trained a small team to travel, to convene listening circles, and to map the local particularities before a single contract was written. It was painstaking, and sometimes investors complained that this was slow. John accepted the complaints. He had seen the cost of speed. Inside the neighborhood, the apprentices continued to refine their craft. Rosa grew bolder in negotiations, but she retained the patience John prized. She had a way of asking hard questions that made people align their arguments with real consequences. Another apprentice, Marco, became adept at parsing the platform's analytics, finding patterns that indicated where the system's promises had outgrown the human buffers. Marco would present his findings not as judgment but as invitations. Here's where the platform's logic could be strengthened if we adjust this human input. John liked that combination, technical curiosity softened by attention to consequence. And there were personal moments, small and grounding. One cold morning, a driver stopped by the coffee shop where John often read the local paper. He had driven the same early route for years and had watched the neighborhood shift. He came with a second-hand thermos of stew, offered it like payment for a favor, and said nothing about it being for John. It was not a grand gesture. It was gratitude that refused ceremony. John accepted the thermos and accepted the gesture's plainness. It reminded him that the work wasn't abstract. It was a ledger of real moments. A child's winter coat replacement, a rent check that could be made on time, a mechanic's ability to stay open. The winter tests arrived in earnest in late December. A nor'easter rolled in with a heavy, persistent snow and a sudden drop in temperature that made everything more brittle. The city's transit slowed. Streets narrowed under icy pressure. Trucks carried more risk. His team had rehearsed this eventuality, but rehearsal is not the same as reality. Phones buzzed with adjustments. Drivers called in sick because their families needed them. Routes shifted. The platform, which had been a useful tool, required human hands to adjust quickly when the maps became unreliable. John found himself doing what he had always done in storms. He focused on what could be done immediately to reduce human harm. He asked Rosa to open a direct line to council staff for urgent permits allowing temporary night deliveries where needed. He authorized immediate use of the escrow for small operators hit by delays. He arranged hot meals for crews stuck in depots. The apprentices stepped in, their training visible and calm. The most notable thing to John was not that they succeeded, though they did, but that their competence made it possible for him to step aside when necessary. His role shifted from direct manager to coordinator of coordinators, a different kind of influence that allowed him to sleep a little when the snow finally eased. Yet the storm also raised a different challenge. A rival network, one that valued speed and scale over human buffers, reacted differently. They promised drivers top pay for the holiday runs that the storm made unpredictable. The temptation was real for many who needed extra cash. John watched this with weary clarity. The rival's offer was short-term cash that could ease immediate strain but also pull labor out of systems that had protections in place. He had to compete not by matching the highest pay, but by making his system more humane in ways money alone could not replicate. Guaranteed time off, childcare support for drivers' families during emergencies, and a promise that damaged vehicles would be repaired without unpaid downtime. Those commitments required capital and an attention to patient financing that the neighborhood's agreements now supplied in part. It was slow, but it offered something more durable than a single bright check. The months following the storm were the kind that test culture. Did the agreements endure when temptation arrived? Did the binders and oversight matter when people were offered more in the short term? The answer mostly was yes. A surprising number of drivers stayed, drawn by the combined package of reliable scheduling, emergency support, and community accountability. Some left for greener pastures. That was inevitable. But those who stayed had a reason to believe their mornings would not be a gamble. By the end of winter, the pilots showed resilience. The platform's metrics were stronger and had adjusted for human inputs. The escrow had been used, and its existence had prevented several households from falling into arrears. The Oversight Committee had enforced rules when necessary and had also adjusted them when the evidence suggested change. The apprentices had matured into a small leadership team that could make fast, humane decisions. John felt, for the first time in a long while, a true sense of collective capacity. the idea that the system could survive a storm even if he were not in the room. The success made new kinds of conversation possible. Investors who had been tentative before were more willing to commit capital when they saw actual resilience rather than clean promises. City departments were more open to co-funding infrastructure improvements that reduced delivery friction. The platform's developers proposed enhancements that embedded human constraints more deeply into the matching algorithm. These were not trivial wins. They meant that scale could proceed, but with the muscle of repair already woven into it. Still, John stayed restless, as anyone who understands systems must. He knew that the world would not stop throwing new tests. Regulatory changes, tech shifts, political cycles, and the constant human churn of families and need. He also knew that success breeds complacency. He watched for it like a gardener watches the first signs of rot. He pushed his team to write the manuals that would outlast them, to document the decisions and the reasons behind them so that future leaders could learn both the what and the why. He also had personal reckonings. Years of steady work had changed the arc of his life. Friends had passed, routines shifted, and the apprentices who once looked to him had families and paths of their own. He felt the tug of stepping back in some ways, not out of fatigue, but because he genuinely wanted the practice to belong to more hands. He started to plan, in small practical ways, how others might take on more leadership. He did it methodically. Delegate authority, confirm competence, create fail-safes, then step aside. It was the same careful logic he applied to everything. Never a sudden absence, always a prepared handover. In late winter, in a meeting that was less dramatic than vital, he proposed a phased succession. Rosa would lead operations with Marco as deputy. 2 apprentices would oversee the oversight committee. John would assume an elder role of advisor and troubleshooter. It was not an abdication. It was a redistribution. They accepted with a mix of gratitude and anxiety. Power, even when shared, feels unfamiliar at first. But as weeks turned into months, their competence proved durable. Spring arrived with that sense of cautious renewal that the city always carried. The streets wet with new light, the bakery windows dusted with the smell of lemon, children biking with precarious confidence. John watched one morning as Rosa stood at a dispatch hub, giving clear directions while keeping an ear open for a driver's question. Marco checked a dashboard and then walked out to speak with a mechanic about a recurring brake issue. The apprentices had become custodians of a practice that made mornings dependable. John took fewer calls. He found his time returning to small pleasures he had deferred. A slow walk in a park, a book read without annotating it for policy, an afternoon spent trying a new recipe with his partner. He did not stop caring. He remained a resource in the nights when the system needed an extra hand. But his days contained broader margins. That was part of the point. The system he helped build would not require his constant presence to protect ordinary lives. The neighborhood, in its imperfect way, had found a delicate balance. They had not defeated entropy or erased risk. They had, however, made choices that made risk survivable. They institutionalized repair, insisted on the human dimension of technology, and trained a new generation to ask the right questions when speed beckoned. It was the sort of victory that does not sparkle in headlines but gives people a better chance at the modest triumphs that matter. Neighborhood businesses that survived, drivers who could sleep, families whose bills were met. John Gambino, who had always preferred listening to speech and consequence to theory, felt a quiet contentment that was not the same as complacency. He knew more tests would come. He expected them. This is the truth of practical work. But the feeling that warmed him as he walked under spring trees was not naive optimism. It was the recognition of habit. A community had learned to protect itself in ways that could be repeated and taught. That is where the story paused, for now not because it had ended but because it had reached a point of sustainable rhythm. The next chapters, he imagined, would be about maintaining habits in the face of new incentives, about making sure the cultural muscle they had developed did not atrophy when temptations returned. He intended to be there for those chapters too, but with less of his hand on the wheel and more of his attention on keeping the binder open for those who would drive. The city woke, as it always does, and people stepped into their mornings with a little less fear and a little more certainty.